innovation and entrepreneurship. You know, these two words are two of the most important words that you will hear often going forward in Abu Dhabi. These two words you'll hear being discussed in the hallways, in the universities, in the grocery stores, in cafes, and so on. These may be buzzwords in the US, but it's going to be a very important set of phrases for us. It's essential. What does it mean? Innovation. Maybe somebody misspelled invention. I don't know. Entrepreneurship. That sounds French. They make it all very complicated, right? So for me, it took a long time to figure out what innovation is. As a child, I come from a traditional Brahmin family back in India. So my mother told me that I should strive to become a scholar. I should train the way I think. So I started thinking aloud in public places. So she got worried and said, no, you don't do that. You have to think with your inner voice. I said, I never understood that. I have to think, but I cannot make any sounds. So I just figured it out. 30 years later, when they invented the earphones, they said that the way to think aloud is stick these electrical wires in your ear, then you're free to think aloud. Guys, the secret is out. Half the people who think they're talking on the mobile phone with earphones in their heads are talking to themselves. I understood innovation then. Welcome to today's NYU Abu Dhabi Institute lecture series. It's a very important part of NYU Abu Dhabi mission. We have something exciting in terms of talk today. It's about the title of the talk is neither visionaries nor bean counters, solving the dilemma of company creation. I won't go through the little blurb that came along. You probably have read it. But I will first introduce to you, it's my great pleasure, to introduce to you Matt Chanoff, an accomplished entrepreneur. He's a co-director of Flashpoint Management Company, which specializes in company creation, and is also co-director of ProFounder, an early-stage investment firm focused on internet security and game technology. He's also an active private investor in early-stage companies. He is very interested and active in poverty alleviation and technology development in projects in Eastland, South Africa, and sits on 4 corporate and not-for-profit boards, Code Guard, Internews, Shining Hope for Communities, and Visionaries. Before his work, ProFounder in Flashpoint, Matt was chief economist at Technology Forecasters Incorporated. He holds an MA in International Economics and US Foreign Policy from Johns Hopkins, and a BA in Philosophy from Sarah Lawrence. Please welcome Matt Chanoff.
Thanks very much, Ramesh. I appreciate it. I'm here really not going to take too much of your time, but what I basically want to do is introduce my friend and colleague, Merrick Furst. Maybe set a little bit of a stage for what he'll be talking about here. I met Merrick about 15 years ago. He had been the head of an institute at Cal Berkeley that was doing artificial intelligence. And he had just sold, I think it was his 7th company at that time. And he'd left those 2 things and was thinking about what the next thing to do would be. And we met and we hit it off. And we spent a very pleasant, almost a year, meeting weekly, having breakfast, talking about a company we might start. We talked about trends in the world. We came up with various ideas and so on. But we very ultimately didn't find anything that we could jump into, that we wanted to jump into. Part of that was our recognition about how hard it is to be an entrepreneur. Part of it was the economy. The time at that time was during the previous recession, 2000, 2001. So Merrick left. He was offered a position, basically the chair in computer science at Georgia Tech. He moved, we were in San Francisco. He moved to Atlanta, to Georgia Tech. I thought at that point that we would stay friends, but that our opportunity to work together had passed. that window had closed. Merrick went on to do some very interesting things. He invented a new curriculum in engineering called Threads, which Georgia Tech adopted, and now a lot of other schools have adopted. He worked on some issues of some abstruse mathematical issues about folding proteins. He did quite a number of very interesting things, but we stayed in touch, and things worked out differently than I had anticipated and maybe feared. We started a company together, then we raised a fund together. I started flying back and forth between Atlanta and San Francisco a lot. But one thing that we never really lost, and in fact sort of gained over that time, was our respect for entrepreneurs and for the difficulty of entrepreneurship. One difference between entrepreneurs and regular people, the way we think about differences in people, is what they take an interest in. What most people take an interest in their business lives and their professional lives is something about the company or something about the tasks they do, something about the reputation or the position that they have or their salary, something like that. Entrepreneurs have a slightly different take. They take an interest in the marketplace itself, in what's going on in the buying and selling, as though they're looking at a souk or at a mall, but on a global scale. And they want to be part of that in some way. Some of them sort of want to slip into it. They want to open up a booth. They want to be part of that bartering, that dynamic. They have some idea about selling a different product or different level of service or staying open later or doing something that enables them to slip into that marketplace. Others have a different vision, which is to disrupt that marketplace in some way. They want to knock down a block of the booths and put up something different, or charge tolls on all the roads that go between all the booths, or paint all of them differently, or do something like that. The sad fact is that most entrepreneurs fail. The ones that slip in, those guys, they mostly fail. More than half of them fail. The ones that really want to disrupt everything, virtually all of them fail. Most of those people fail. That's a big failure mode. Why they fail, the reasons, that question is not something that's really pushed as far as it could be. Because in each case, there seems to be a plausible explanation for it. They misjudged the marketplace, they didn't have a great enough vision, they weren't working hard enough, they made some kind of amateur mistake that a professional, more experienced person wouldn't make, something like that. Those answers don't really explain, they might explain individual failures, but they don't explain how much failure there is. And more important than that, they don't really point you towards trying to understand what success might be. So about 3 years ago, Merrick started on a journey to really push hard at that question, to really try to understand what a failure mode is and what a success might be. It's been a very interesting journey. It's taken him through behavioral economics. It's taken him through a branch of psychology called immunity to change theory. It's taken him through branches of computer science and philosophy, something called intuitionistic logic, something called homotopy type theory. It's taken him through philosophy, through Heidegger and Jean Merleau-Ponty. It's taken him through helping people create some pretty spectacularly successful companies. And I think most important, it's taken him to the creation of this thing, Flashpoint. Flashpoint is not an accelerator or an incubator in the normal sense of it, but maybe in the Q&A afterwards you can help us think of a word, because we don't really have a word for what it is. What it tries to be and what we're trying to create here is a piece of equipment. If you can imagine a particle physicist, for instance, a particle physicist can't really be what he is or she is. They can't do particle physics without a cyclotron, without the equipment that it takes to do that kind of work. What we're trying to create at Flashpoint is a piece of equipment for entrepreneurs to enable them to be who they are and do that work. And, you know, I think ultimately something like what we're doing at Flashpoint will be something that entrepreneurs normally default use in the process of what they're trying to create, of making their dreams a reality, making their who they need to be, getting them there. So I've been sort of on the periphery of his journey here. I've been helping him at various points. We're much closer now in working together on it. And it's been a huge privilege for me. And it's a privilege right now to introduce him to you and let him tell you a little bit about the things that he's done in this journey.
Thanks, Matt. That was, I didn't know any of those things about me, or at least or not the way you thought about them. So, oh good, it's up here. This is what Flashpoint looks like. So this is where when I'm not here, I'm almost always there. That's a space that they created for me at the university that and Matt, by the way, made the story sound like it was a lot more coherent than it actually. I'm going to tell you the story in a more coherent way, but it surely didn't feel coherent in the path that brought me here. What it felt like was I somehow convinced myself to be in a place where that the university would ask me to volunteer for something. And I volunteered for it, and I thought I would have a clue about what to do, and then I was going to fail. And I knew I was going to fail. And I failed before, and I really hate it. And I was willing to do a lot not to fail. And in order to not fail, I had to make a bet. I had to try something that I decided couldn't be a kind of a half measure. I had to try to do something 100% or 110%. And if it didn't work out, at least I knew I had given it the best shot. And I want to share with you what it was we tried. And now that it seems like it might actually matter, I want to share that with you. And the way Matt talked about it being equipment, I think there is something here. I think we figured something out that is worth knowing about. So I wanted to share with you what that is. Let me start by talking through what we had to work out. So Matt is correct. As far as we can tell, almost every attempt at innovation fails. Almost every attempt at innovation fails. So if you don't believe that, then a lot of what I'm going to say to you may not be that meaningful. If you think that that one can just decide to go be innovative, and for example, one could have an idea that would make a company happen, and that you should just make that happen, and that often works out, then I really don't have much to offer you except luck. Good luck. It doesn't actually seem to be that way. The numbers are just really bad. I'll give you an example. If you go to the world's best venture capitalists, now things are kind of frothy in the world of early stage investing right now, so the time that venture capitalists have to make decisions about investments has gone down, but it used to be a place like Kleiner Perkins would take like 4 months, or Interwest would take 4 or 5 months to do diligence on a company that came by. They would do everything they could do to figure out why they couldn't convince themselves not to invest. And then once they could see no reason not to invest, then they would spend 4 months talking to customers and interviewing the employees and trying to figure out what the markets were like. Then they would make their investment. And here's what the portfolio numbers say. If you do that much work, if you're the world's best venture capitalist and you have arbitrary amounts of money to put into deals after you've invested the first time, your portfolio typically looks like 1/3 of them go to zero. 1/3 of them return something but not much. 1/3 of them return a little bit more, and one of them sometimes returns so much more that it makes your whole portfolio. And if you look at that one that returns so much more, invariably, and I mean that like always, invariably, that company is on the third idea from the time you invested in it. So it's not the A plan that they showed up with, it's not the B plan that they moved to, it's the C plan. And so you have to ask yourself, if the best in the world can't figure out whether innovation is going to work, and if their portfolio looks that bad, imagine how bad it is for the deals that can't even get to that place. So let me talk to you. I want to make it less dry, if I could. So I want to tell you a story about how innovation goes, just to share with you how people think about it. This is like how people think about innovation going, and it doesn't really go like this, but I want to make sure that you have this in mind at least. So we think it goes based on something which there's a famous philosopher, Ayn Rand, who wrote a book called The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged. Perhaps you've read it. It's something very popular among college kids. Kind of stands there and says, here's how we think the world works. There are makers and there are takers, and the makers are the kinds of people who throughout the centuries have had some vision, and then they carried out that vision, and that made something in the world. And in fact, if you look at most of the structures we've built to support innovation and entrepreneurship, most of the structures we build more or less start with like this. You believe that there's a person in the world that has a vision and an idea, and that you're going to then support them on this crazy journey that they're going to take. And let me show you the movie version of that. So I don't know if you know this movie, it's older. I feel like I should make a younger movie for younger people. But the original version of Ayn Rand's book, The Fountainhead, there's a person in the book that kind of embodies this notion of a person with a vision. It's a guy named Rourke, and he's an architect. And he sees something. It starts with seeing something that you think has to exist in the world. In this case, it's a place with a particular type of building. Now, everybody knows, and remember, this is the movie version of entrepreneurship or innovation. Everybody knows you can't make it happen by yourself. So the first thing the protagonist does after they see what they have to see is they kind of draw pictures of it and try to explain it to others. And you do that, you get together with the people that have money who can fund your project. And if you're any good at this, you can tell a very good story, which is, that's a good use of language, is make up a story. There's going to be a building over there. There's going to be incredible innovation. And they buy in, and then at that point, you not only do you have a vision in your head, but you've got a vision in their head, and they fund it. At which point, the hard work, everybody thinks the hard work of entrepreneurship starts, and you figure it's not going to be any fun. We're going to make it. We're going to build it. It's going to be like breaking up concrete until we can eventually make it be the way we want. And everybody knows what happens in entrepreneurship, which is, boy, you have to have your vision, because everybody's going to come along and tell you it's not going to work, and there's going to be roadblocks they put in their way. So you have to sort of stand there and strike up the Superman pose to keep your vision going. And that's what happens in the movie too. And of course, everybody knows, the vision's not just in your head. You're not stupid. You talk to your customers. You go back to your customers. You change your plans. You listen to them. But why do you do that? Like, why do you keep going in normal entrepreneurship? Well, you keep going because you kind of have this thing that you feel like you're getting a grip on. That's the way it feels. It's kind of in the back of your head. It's like a light that draws you to it, that you're trying to make it real. Have you tried to build things? Don't you feel like you're holding on to something? And the truth is, the reason people think this and the reason that they usually keep going down this path is because they hope that someday this will be their office. And that's the story that people tell after they're successful, by the way. If you ask them what the story was, they'd sort of tell you the story like this. In fact, Matt sort of did it already. Merrick had this idea, he was going to go down this path, and eventually stands on stage, and he does this with a lot of companies. But it's nothing like that. It's nothing like that, and that's what I want to share with you. It doesn't look like that at all. So I want to talk to you about how innovation actually goes, because that's actually a totally different movie. That's more like this movie. You know this movie, Inception? In Inception, it has a similar start, the movie Inception. In movie Inception, it starts with an entrepreneur, a protagonist, and the person also has in mind the customer. And this movie is really simple. It's like one customer, if you remember the movie. And not only that, he has this very cool technology. He can build anything you can imagine. I mean, he's not even constrained by real-world constraints. You can literally, anything you could imagine, you could build. Maybe it's a little bit like software or something. But in order to do it, he has to first convince people to partner with him to work on it. So he also, in this movie, has to construct a team, just like in the first movie. And this is the team he puts together. I mean, you can see these guys have the chops. They have weapons. They're diverse. They can pose. They've worked together before. Okay, the only thing is, this is how he thinks the team looks, and this is how the team itself thinks it looks, and this is how the investors think it looks. This is nothing like what the team looks like. I'm going to show you what the team actually looks like. This is what the team actually looks like. They're all dreaming. They're all literally imagining a future world that has customers in it behaving the way they think their customers are going to behave. They have an illusion. They have a shared illusion which they plug into and then they build to. In the movie, they can make anything. So in the movie, and oh, by the way, the problem with these dreams, and this is actually where I want to start. So here's like insight number one. Insight number one is, not only are they dreaming, but the problem with the dream is it feels real. And I don't mean that kind of like, well, everybody's a dreamer or there's fantasies. I mean that in the sense of there's actually a human pathology. There's actually a cognitive error that happens that's been studied. People have won Nobel Prizes for. Behavioral economists have realized there's the world and there's what's in your head, and they're not the same. The world is much different than what's in your head, and you kind of know that, but people don't act like they know that when they do entrepreneurship for some reason. And what we've done is just said, well, what if we actually pay attention to that? Because the problem is, if you don't recognize that what's in your head and what's in the world are actually different, if you just don't notice because of this pathology that kind of like operates like the blind spot. You all know, I guess, from some point in your early education that there's an optic nerve that sticks into the back of your retina, and there's actually a blind spot in your vision. And then 2 minutes after someone shows you that, there's no blind spot in your vision. The brain sort of fills it in. It's the same way with these cognitive illusions. You see the world and you think you get it. You don't notice that you don't get it. You don't notice you have these pathological blind spots. In the movie, they think that here would be a very cool thing to build. Let's build a roller coaster in Buenos Aires. And not like the Space Mountain version of Disney. They mean the actual roller coaster in actual Buenos Aires. And so they make one. Now the thing you should notice that I want to pull away from the movie is there's a problem with that product, which is it doesn't attach to reality. I mean, really, it doesn't attach to reality. And this is the first problem that I want to talk to you about. It's the first problem of entrepreneurship. It's the problem of attaching to reality. In the movie, they have a gimmick. Any of you, have you seen the movie? Remember the movie? It's a little bit old now. In the movie, the guy DiCaprio, who's the protagonist, he carries around with him a little top that he spins. And he knows that when he builds when he's building this world for the customer, sometimes it's a real world and sometimes it's a world that's just in his dream. And he realizes he can't tell. And so what he does is he pulls out this little top. If he gets lost, he can't remember whether it's the real world or the fake world, and he spins the top. And the thing is, this top is a very special thing. It attaches to reality. So if he's in the real world, gravity applies and friction applies, and eventually the top stops. And in the fake world, what happens? It runs forever. He spins it, and it just spins, and it spins, and it spins, because real things that aren't attached to reality, that's what they do. A lot like startups that fail. You start them, and they spin, and they spin, and they spin, and nothing happens. It's the same problem. They're not attached to reality. So the first thing to pay attention to in entrepreneurship, and this is what we found ourselves forced to pay attention to, is you have to figure out a way to attach to reality. And that's a much less pleasant process than you might imagine. Partly because it doesn't look like you have to do anything. It feels like you know. That person's going to buy something. How do I know? He told me. How do I know? It's just like the thing he bought over there. What makes you think they're the same? Because I showed them and they look the same. It's just not real. It feels real. It's a cognitive error. It's an illusion. And so the first problem is to attach to innovation to reality. And I mean, people are trying different things. And I want to share with you some of the things that we've tried that don't work. And I'm here to tell you something that's a little disturbing, because there are a lot of things like in the world that people are trying, but they don't work. And I want to see if I can explain to you why they don't work, because we had to figure that out in order to make something which had a better chance of working, which I do think we have now. So people said, well, if I want to make something which attaches to the world, then here's a silly idea, which people have done before. Why don't we make a really big thing and see if it works? Why don't we like build it all out and then launch it and see if it works? So one thought is, well, why make a whole big thing? Why don't you just make the smallest thing you can make, because it's cheaper and faster. Let's see if that attaches to the world. Anyone try using minimum viable product ideas? I mean, it's sort of all the rage in neighborhoods I live in. But let me see if I can give you one insight into why it's wrong. Here's my favorite early person who tried to make a minimum viable product. It's Dr. Frankenstein. So he needed a friend. He needed a minimum viable human being. So he went through the process of thinking, well, what would a minimum viable human being have to have? It would have to have arms and legs. So we went and got some and attached it to a body, and had to have a brain, which I think was hard to find, and he put it in. And he ended up with what's lying there on the table. That was his minimum viable product. But it wasn't what he wanted. If you know the story, I hope. Why wasn't it what he wanted? Because it just continues to lie there on the table, like what normally happens when you do startups. You make them and they sort of lie there. And because there's nothing driving it. There's no motive force. Now, it is true that what you see happen is if you make something and you want to see if it actually will work in the marketplace, as long as you can continue to fund it, you can get entrepreneurs to articulate the arms and the legs of the startup so it looks like it's a startup. It's just not what they want it to be. It's not functioning. There's no motive force to it. Am I resonating with you in some ways? So the problem with trying to go about entrepreneurship this way is we don't know how to create life. It's just like we just don't. We don't know how to make something that will just come to life. This is what people want when they do startups. That any business that you want it to somehow have the spark of life. You want it to be animated. And I want to start by talking to you a bit about what that means. Where does that animation come from, and how could you get it if you can't create life? Well, the force that, let me just give a name to it. The force that animates startups, or the force that animates any company, I don't care what company, I think it's large companies, little companies, the force that animates companies is something that we're calling authentic demand. What authentic demand looks like for a startup, for example, and this is, I'm using words that are actually true from Flashpoint startups, where we've done 35 companies this way, is you get on the phone, you're in Atlanta, which is not it's not one of the central hub cities. You're in Atlanta, you're a startup, you get on the phone, you call a Fortune 5 company in Chicago, you say sort of the right 8 words in the right way, and by the end of the week, they've sent an executive team from Chicago to Atlanta to demand pricing for a product that doesn't exist. What authentic demand feels like is your customers follow you home. They don't agree to run your product because you ask them to. They get enough of a whiff of what your product is, and they stand outside your door until it's made. It has that sort of drawing force to it. That's what authentic demand is. And we think that ultimately authentic demand is required for success. And so we've had to pay a lot of attention to how might one find or construct or get what it is that you actually, what was important for you for the success of your business. So you could say, where is it? Where is authentic demand? And let me tell you, this is kind of what the world looks like if you're an entrepreneur. There's this vast body of the world, which is those are your customers. And they're out there. They're behaving you don't really know how they're behaving, but they're behaving. There's people say, you go over there and you see that little wave, and that happened because you went and said, would you like one of these? And they go, yeah. And then over there, someone else says, hey, I heard what you said to them. I would like some of that too. And then you get the sense of power. You get the sense of enormous power behind that. There's swells and there are tides. You get the sense of this enormous demand in the world. So, but what is authentic demand going to look like when you kind of organize it and you find it? It's not going to look like that mess. And I'm going to share with you a little bit that there's a reason that the world looks like it's full of demand. And that reason has to do with this, one of the pathologies that goes on in your head, and it has to do with an asymmetry in everybody's psychology. This is cross-cultural. There's an asymmetry in our psychologies between our experience of loss and our experience of gain. It's simply the case that the value to a human being of not losing something is significantly larger than the value to a human being of gaining something. The value to not lose $1,000 is significantly higher than the value to gain $1,000, about 2.25. It's actually measurable by these psychologists, which blows my mind, but it seems true. So the reason that demand seems like it's everywhere to an entrepreneur or to any human being is that the absence of demand feels like loss. And so we avoid discovering the absence of demand because it's twice as painful as even getting a little bit of positive sense. So I'm going to come back to this and share with you what this means. But here's what I think demand feels like. It doesn't feel like this mess. Here's what it feels like. It feels inexorable. It feels like this whirlpool that's sucking you in. It doesn't feel like I'm going to make a product and someone might use it, or I can convince 10 people to use it. It feels like if you don't do it, someone's going to force you to do it. They just drag it out of you. Have you ever felt, any of you in businesses where you feel like you have some authentic demand? Probably all of you are in some ways, maybe not for startups. It's a little harder to come by for startups. That's what you want to feel like. So here's a nice question. Can you make it? Can you create it? That would be my first question. Well, you tell me. Can you get that boat to go fast enough to create a whirlpool? You see, the problem with authentic demand is it's not a surface phenomenon. It's something that happens much deeper, psychologically much deeper. You can make that boat go around, and that's what startups do. They create lots of what looks like motion, and you can fool a lot of people for a while. But then when you run out of power, there's no actual demand there. So if you can't make it, can you look for it? That would be a natural. So you can't make it, can you look for it? But this is where it gets really interesting, because when you go look for it, and we've worked with a lot of people that look for it, this is pretty much who you are. You're Wile E. Coyote. Does this cartoon character make sense in Abu Dhabi? One of my favorite cartoon characters. This is this poor character that's always chasing after this little bird, a roadrunner, never able to catch it. Then the roadrunner is forever fooling Wile E. Coyote. I mean, Wile E. Coyote is always finding himself in this kind of a position. He's always, he follows the roadrunner off the edge of a cliff, and then he looks down and realizes, oh, gravity applies to me, and then he falls. Or in another scene, the roadrunner wants to fool him, so paints a picture of a tunnel in a cliff. And then the Wile E. Coyote smashes his face into the tunnel and cliff. Why? Because Wile E. Coyote is always wrong and doesn't realize that he's wrong. The world is not the way Wile E. Coyote thinks it is, but he doesn't know. And there's a famous, it's already a TED Talk, you've probably seen it, but there's a wonderful question you could ask an audience like this. It goes like this. What does it feel like when you're wrong? Wile E. Coyote is always wrong. But what does it feel like for you when you're wrong? You ever stop to think about what it feels like when you're wrong? This is the interactive portion of the talk. So, anyone want to share what it feels like when they're wrong? Painful? Yeah, thank you so much for doing that. This is why I go around and I say hello, because you'll feel better about saying hello. And you won't throw anything later, maybe. So that's, the cool thing about this is it's kind of reliable. You answered a great question. It wasn't the question I asked. The question I asked was, what does it feel like when you're wrong? The question you answered was, what does it feel like when you discover you're wrong? You see, the moment before you discovered you're wrong, it doesn't feel painful. It doesn't feel like anything. Well, actually, that's not entirely true. It feels like being right. It's not distinguishable in your head. This is a key insight and a key problem for us as entrepreneurs or working with entrepreneurs is they think they're right, but they could be wrong, but they think they're right. They're sure they're right. But the feeling of being sure you're right is also the feeling of being wrong. It's not the feeling you get when you discover you're wrong, which is really terrible if you've made too big a bet on it. So this is something we really have to seriously address. And this is the origins of this new field we've created, which actually I just won this award at Georgia Tech, the 2013 award for Outstanding Achievement in Research Innovation. It's actually a new field, I think, of engineering. It's a way to engineer the creation of startups. Just like you might engineer bridges or you might engineer airplanes. And I want to share with you, I think we now have some basic principles that one could apply to the work that you might do to do a startup successfully. And these are these are touchstones to ground truths, much like any kind of science or engineering discipline is. And I think we've now, after 2 years of doing this continuously, actually developed some enabling practices. And I want to share with you some of that. Now, it turns out that there are some things we've learned that I want to tell you about them. I want to tell you them in a kind of funny way. By the way, it's a picture of me. That's how I dress up at Flashpoint. This is Buffy the Vampire Slayer, for those of you who don't know the cultural reference. This is a woman who goes around killing vampires. And the thing about vampires is they don't ever die. You can kill them, they come back. I want to share with you several ways that people think, and things that entrepreneurs currently do, which we've discovered by going back to sort of the very first principles. They can't work. I want to say that really strongly. Not only don't they work, they sort of can't work. That is because but you don't notice it. And so that means that you use it in your thinking process and it leads you to conclusions to build things and invest in things and spend time on things that unfortunately they don't work, and they sort of can't work. And I want to tell you, here's one of them. Entrepreneurs think that you can understand how you can get reliable sense of whether someone else is going to do something by thinking that that other person is is rationally self-interested. Let me say that a little more carefully. It doesn't work, that is, it's not reliable to reason that that person is going to do something out of their own rational self-interest. Let me give you an example of that. So actually the company that Matt and I started called Damballa, which thank you very much, is doing very well right now. It's got like 93 employees and it's got Fortune 5 customers. It's doing fine. But that's like $29 million of investment later that you have to dig out of. Because here's how it started though. In about 2006, some professors at Georgia Tech said, hey, we think we can do the following cool thing with internet security. And I thought, okay, well, we wanted to start a company, and I would become the CEO, and we raised a bunch of money. Oh, it was before we raised money. I got out on an airplane, and I flew out to meet the chief information security officer at eBay. And I explained to him what we were going to do. And I said, look, I think if we install this, it'll stop a lot of fraud. And he looked at it, and he said, absolutely. In fact, he did this sort of back-of-the-envelope calculation with me, and he said, this would save us $40 million every year. And he said to me, how much would it cost? Which is, I always thought, well, if someone asks you how much it costs, it means they probably want to buy it. So he said, how much would it cost? And I said, well, we're thinking we could sell it for maybe $150,000 a year. And he said, oh, okay, do you have it? And I said, no, but I'll make you one. He said, great, come back. So I ran home, I talked to Matt. Matt invested, other people invested, put a team together, and we built the darn thing. And I went back out and I showed it to him, and he checks it, and it's going to fit into his system, and sure enough, it's going to definitely save him $40 million a year, and it's only going to cost him $150,000, and I'm in his office, and I'm showing it to him, and he told me he wanted it, and that was 2007, and it's 2014, and he still hasn't bought. eBay still hasn't bought. Now, you could ask the question, why not? But let me tell you right now, that is simply the wrong question. The right question is, what made me think for 1 second that he would make a decision out of rational self-interest? It just slipped your logic, it turns out. Because what we know from behavioral decision theory and a lot of other work, people don't simply decide that way. Now, it's not to say that post hoc, when he goes back and explains to himself why he bought something, that he wouldn't be able to tell you he did it to save money. But that's not actually what causes people to make decisions. So that means that if you're walking around as an entrepreneur, you're trying to reason the way they, for example, teach you in business school, reason that this market does this because it'll actually save money. People just don't actually behave that way and operate that way. And here, the reason I have to do that Buffy the Vampire Slayer thing is I can explain that to you as many times as you want. In fact, I can explain it to myself, and I've seen the research. And then 15 minutes after my talk, we'll be talking, and I'll be telling you why someone's going to buy something because it's going to make them money or it's going to save them money. It's just built into our language. It's built into our brains. But you can't rely on it. I mean, just like you can't rely, well, I'll give you some other examples in a second. So let me show you the second thing this is even more disturbing. So the first thing I'm trying to tell you is you can't kind of reason in a positive way. You can't say people would do something because it makes sense that they would do it. It doesn't really work. We know that, everybody knows that, but we don't act like we know it. So I'm asking you, what would it look like if you actually behaved in a way that methodologically controlled for that error in thought? That's what we've done at Flashpoint. Are you still interested in this? I'm going to tell you the second thing. The second thing is, people think, well, if you can't reason about it, then you ought to just make a product and see if they want to buy it. Well, suppose you really want to understand what it is that authentic demand is like. You want to get a sense of what could I be so that the other couldn't avoid me? What could I be in such a way that the other was just going to experience me as they have to have it? And people say, well, here's the gold standard. The gold standard must be, let's make a version. Let's make a beta. Let's build a prototype. Certainly, the only way we find that is by building a prototype. That must be the gold standard. But I'm here to tell you that from first principles, I can show you that actually you cannot get any information of the type you want. Any information of the type you want by showing people a product. It seems crazy, but let me show you. Let me share an example with you. So imagine, if you would, a young man comes home from work one day, and he walks up the path to his house. And out from the front door, it's been a hard day, he's been really working hard. Out from the front door of his house, his little daughter runs out. And she runs up and says, "Daddy, Daddy, I made you a mud pie, Daddy. Daddy, I made you a mud pie." And this man looks down at his daughter and says, "Oh, dear, that's the most beautiful mud pie I ever saw. That's like the perfect mud pie. I can see how much time and effort you put. Oh, thank you. I didn't even know I wanted it." You see, in that moment, everybody's being authentic. The little girl really did put her heart and soul into that mud pie. The father really didn't know that he wanted it, but when he saw it, it was exactly what he wanted. It was perfect. It was the perfect product. But I want to say, I think it would be a mistake for that little girl to think that if she went into the mud pie business, it would be any other fathers in the neighborhood that would care. I also think it would be a mistake for her to even think that this father would want a mud pie tomorrow. What I'm trying to say to entrepreneurs is, even though it doesn't feel like it, products are mud pies. And actually, it's a cognitive error. The way that cognitive error is experienced is it's actually a placebic effect. That is, it doesn't feel in the moment like it's a mud pie. It actually feels like you've learned something about the customer when you show it to them and they react. But it's not. They bought it because why they buy it from you? Because you're a student at NYU and the person remembers being a student and cares about NYU and they bought it. And you think they're buying it because they want it. Whatever want means. It's just not, you can't get the information you need from products. You have to find some other way to get the information. It's very disturbing, at least I find it disturbing. Let me show you a third way that people get this wrong. This is sort of all the rage right now in entrepreneurial circles. They say, well, here's what we have to do. We have to go out and talk to a lot of customers. You can't figure out the answers, so just go talk to them. See what they want. But let me, and dealing with NYU, we're post-enlightenment in the sense that we know that our brains are not capable of reasoning their way to the correct answers. You have to sometimes actually do experiments. So for example, otherwise, people would still think that heavy things fall faster than light things. By the way, they don't. So, but many people probably still think that. I mean, why? Because a heavy thing, let's say you take a 2-pound weight in this hand and a 1-pound weight in this hand, and it's obvious that it pulls down harder, twice as hard. And so it seems reasonable that a heavy thing would fall faster than a light thing. In fact, if you do a naive experiment, you drop a brick in a piece of paper, the brick does hit first. But it's just not true. So if you want to build airplanes, you kind of have to go check. If I'm assuming that heavy things fall faster than light things, I better check, not just kind of reason my way. Same way, you can't just go, we know from tons of work, now it's like 50, 60 years of work in psychology, that you cannot understand much about another human being by talking to them. You think you can. Literally, it's called a persistent illusion. You think you can. And if you don't believe me, I'll give you a concrete example. Take a friend and go interview somebody for a job. You just take any friend and walk into a place and have an interview with someone, and then walk out and ask your friend, would that person do a good job for our company? Now, at first, what will happen when you realize that you disagree is you'll think your friend is an idiot. But don't forget, your friend thinks you're an idiot now. You cannot rely, the problem is human beings cannot, you will have a persistent sense that you know what just happened. The person says to you, I really want it. You feel like they really want it. But it's just not true, you see, it's placebic. And I'm here to ask you the following question, which we asked ourselves 2 years ago. What would happen if you just accepted the scientific fact that human beings feel like they know something when they talk to somebody about what's going on with them, but they actually don't? And you then had to deal with that as part of your work with entrepreneurship. What would that look like? And the answer is, it looks really different. And, but first, you've got to feel kind of lost. Because I think pretty much what I've just said from first principles is all the things that people normally do to be successful in entrepreneurship, simply not only don't they work, they sort of can't work. Can't work to reason about rational self-interest, because that's not how people actually work. Can't work to build product and show it to people, because it's all mud pies. And it can't work to talk to people because you're stuck with this problem with something called demand characteristic and these persistent delusions. So now what are you left with? By the way, this is a pretty good explanation for why there's so much failure. So you could ask, well, what are you left with? And I want to share with you something more positive, although it's oddly enough, it's more positive, but it's in something we call the negative space. And let me tell you what I mean by that. Do you want to see something positive, or are you happy just to be lost in this? So what I want to share with you is another way to think about doing entrepreneurship. And there's going to be 3 parts to it. And each part, the first part's the weirdest part, but each part has this weird property that it's very hard to keep it in your head. And I've been trying to figure out why it's so hard to keep it in your head. And I think the reason is that it's a lot like the experience that people have with this Necker cube. You know this example from psychology? It's cool. You draw a picture of a cube, and if you stare at it, maybe it'll pop out of the screen at you. Does that happen for some of you? And then if you take a second, you can shake your head. You can't get it under your conscious control. You can actually make it pop back into the page, or vice versa. It can reverse. Were you able to make that happen? Now, the interesting thing about this psychologically isn't that it goes back and forth. It's that it's actually impossible for your brain to hold it both ways at the same time. You can either see it popping out or you can see it popping in. That's it. You can't have it both simultaneously. So what I want to share with you is another way to look at the world that turns out to be a place you can stand. It's hard to stay there for reasons I think we're starting to understand. But if you stay there, the world looks different, and you can do work there, and you can do entrepreneurship work there more reliably. And I'm going to show you 3 different things that all of which seem to be required for entrepreneurship to work. We can't get rid of any one of the 3. So the first one is, if you can't rely on people to be rationally self-interested, what can you rely on them to be? And the answer is, you cannot, let me try to say this, you can rely on people to do what they cannot not do. That is true. I mean, it seems tautologically true, I know, but it's actually not. It's not, you can't actually, you can't knock out the double negative in that sentence and just say people do what they do. That doesn't, it actually, this has a different meaning than you might think. This actually really means, if you truly were able to understand a person, your customer, let's say, and you were truly able to see the situation that they're in, then it might be the case that you could see it so clearly that you can see that it would be impossible for them to not do something. It would be really weird for them not to do something. And imagine what it would be like if you could see about your customer something that they could not do. You might be able to present them an opportunity to do something that they simply couldn't not do, because if they didn't do it, they wouldn't be themselves. It's an odd thing to say. It's like you're really looking to see what it is that a person couldn't avoid doing as opposed to what someone could do. So it's not like I'm thinking, oh, I should make this because people would make more money. That doesn't make any sense. I'm going to do this because if they don't do it, they like die. Or I don't do this, they lose their job. I don't do this, then they're not really who they were. Now the problem with this is you can't see straight. You can't see it right because you don't actually see it in the world. And what we find happens when you do the work to try to go figure out what it is that this looks like, here, I'll tell you what it looks like. It looks like, in the end, something completely obvious that was always there. It just wasn't apparent. That is, the way you looked at it just wasn't ever like that before, and now it's almost like you have a secret in your company that no one else has, which is you know how to look at the world so you can see people for who they are in a way that you can figure out they can't not be this. Oddly enough, when you actually do the work, it has this kind of feeling of being a lot like science. That is, you end up with, you construct theories of a certain type about people and situations that they're in. You construct testable hypotheses, which aren't just like, well, I think they want it. It's actually literally a testable hypothesis. And then you can do the experiments. And what's interesting about, for those of you who care from an academic point of view, because maybe 1 or 2 of you are from that place, unlike normal science, in which the theory and the hypothesis are sort of obvious and the experiment is hard, for some reason in this work, the theory and the hypothesis side is all hard, really hard to get to, and the experiments turn out to be really straightforward and easy. Okay, let me tell you one more thing. This is of the first 3 things. It's, and this is, we call this the negative space, by the way. So the positive space would be, I think people do things because they're rationally self-interested. So I think people need this. I think people want something. Turns out I don't think you can get any purchase on the world that way. It feels like you can, but I don't think you ever know that. I just think it's not there. I think it placebically feels like it's there. But you can get yourself into a place where you say, this is who the person is. In this situation, if they didn't do this, they wouldn't be that. And because I see that's the way they are, I can expect them reliably to behave this way. And you can work there. It's called the negative space. But you can't do both at the same time. It's got this kind of Necker cube phenomena. So the second thing is the way we end up doing entrepreneurship now is completely opposite of what you might expect. In the negative space, in the positive space, you might say, I'm going to add this feature because I think people will want it. Or I'm going to give them this ability because I think that's what they need. In the negative space, you actually do the exact opposite. You ask yourself the question in this sort of negative way. What could I avoid doing because if I can avoid it, what would I have to do because if I didn't do it, then they could avoid it? I'm not going to repeat that, but just believe me, you can sort of, what I find interesting about this is after a lot of work, you can actually learn to talk this way, which confuses your friends, but actually enables your startup to work. And when you figure out what you don't have to make, that's what you don't make. And so you end up with these things that are so simple, which it doesn't, I mean, I know it seems simple, but I know it seems silly, but it almost is like Zen-like in the sense that you discover eventually the only things that are in your product are the things that actually, if they weren't there, then people would be able to avoid. And so the only reason they're there is because then people couldn't avoid, so that's why they're there, and everything else goes away. And it's, I can tell you that in practice, it's complicated to do, but it actually simplifies everything. And it's much more effective. Now, it's a little bit less fun in some ways because, wow, wouldn't it be cool if I made one of these? Or I can see it, I want to make one. And so you work in the negative space, it's a little darker over there, but it's actually more accurate, and you have to protect yourself from flowing back into the first. Okay, so that's the first thing. There's the three things that you have to do to become successful, I'm convinced now, is the first is, or look, I want to say it that way, people are successful without this, but if you want to be reliably successful, the first is you have to see the world for the way it is. And I'm here to suggest to you that if you look at the world in this positive way, which is how we all talk, like people have needs and wants, and that people might do something if I did it, and I could build products to go figure that out and test, it doesn't seem to work. But if you work in this negative space, that is, you try to figure out something that you would understand that people could not do, and then you figure out how to make something which simply is a thing that had to be that way because otherwise people could not do it, you can do that work, and you actually can do that work reliably. But that's not enough, it turns out. There's another problem. And here's the second problem. The second problem is even when you see customers for who they are, which means that in this situation, they couldn't avoid you because then they wouldn't be who they were. That's what true desire is. Then you discover that, and unfortunately, customers are people. Well, I don't mean unfortunately in that sense. I mean, fortunately, your customers are people. But people are immune to change. Now, you must know this. I mean, you must know how hard it is to change. Any of you who have ever tried to change, you know it about yourself. I mean, this has been known for a long time. I guess the classic experiment from the psych literature goes like this. There's a pill. You go to your cardiologist. I hope this doesn't happen to you. But you go to your cardiologist, and your cardiologist says to you, I'm sorry, the test came back, and you have a bad disease. And here's the problem. If you don't do anything, you're going to die. The good news is, though, we have a pill which if you take it every day and just make a small lifestyle change, you'll be fine. So don't take the pill, make the lifestyle change, you die. Take the pill, make the lifestyle change, you're fine. And by the way, the pill is free, and it has no side effects. So I don't know, could there be a more perfect product? You take it, you live. You don't take it, you die. No side effects and free. Okay, so 1 in 7 people is taking that pill after a year. That's just the way it is. Why? Because human behaviors, are simply immune to change. The 2 people that have studied this the most, I went and spent a lot of time working with, are Bob Keegan and Lisa Leahy at Harvard. And they've studied this question, and they have a whole theory about what causes these immunities. Turns out the immunities are mappable. That is, it's almost always the case that a behavior that has to change, the reason you can't change it is because it's actually supporting something else that they're committed to. It's hard to see, you have to know how to do the work, but you can actually map these immunities. So now you can, once you see the customer for who they are, and what it is that at least they would change, if they change that, they would actually be moving in an authentic way towards something, then you can see why you can't get them to buy your product, even though it would actually do what you think it would do. It's because even the small behavior change of buying your product as opposed to someone else's product, they're already immune to. If you map these, you can actually read off of the map what had to be in your product. So it turns out what has to be in your product are features that take off the table the immunities that your customers have to the changes that enable them to get to where they were going anyway, which you were able to see from the first part. Now the last of the 3 things that I have to tell you, I wish I could stop there. There's one more thing I have to talk to you about. So it's not just you can't see the world for the way it is because of these pathologies you have, we all have. And not just that even when you see the world for the way it is that you can't help your customers because they're immune to change. It's that the people who are doing the work itself, the innovators, the entrepreneurial team, guess what? They're people too. Which means they're also immune to change. Which means even when they see the world for what it is, and they see what they would have to be like in order for their company to be successful, they can't actually change. So we have to address that also. And that's the last of the 3 things. And it turns out you can actually create a developmental culture where you train people how to take an interest in changing each other's behavior inside the company, and people can get better at it. That's what our experience is. And Keegan and Leahy have a whole set of processes around it. That's it. It's those 3 things. If you do those 3 things, it's what we're calling authentic innovation, as opposed to just innovation. And here's what it is. You see customers for who they can't avoid being. You then map their immunities to change, which gives you the product. You then figure out how to adaptively change the mindset of your own team so you can actually change the team. And then you get what you want, which is you can simply enable customers to be more themselves. That's what desire, that's how you meet desire. Matt had a way of saying it. It's, if you do the startup engineering stuff, what ends up happening is when you get this authentic demand and you see what has to happen, then you've got an engineering problem. Then you just have to figure out how to build the thing, for the most part. And so at that point, you sort of have the normal risks of startups. So in some sense, if you do the work of startup engineering at the beginning, you end up with a situation where then you have just a regular old engineering problem. And so now the problem is just reducing risk there. Not that you've got it all out, but that's at least a much easier problem to solve typically. And I thought I would just to give you a feel for numbers or something, we have enough people who have gone through Flashpoint in this process, we can sort of split them into two categories. They kind of self-select out. There are some people that came in and mistook what we were doing. They thought we were just giving them money and a space to work and some mentors. And so they just kept building to their original vision. And some people actually engage this process we have, which is this very intense, day-to-day. We show them methodology, and we actually work with them. As Matt said, it's like a piece of equipment for doing entrepreneurship. And we split it up, and I'll put them in, and then you can look at some of them. Some of them have just stopped, so dead. But some of them are growing. Anybody would tell you they're growing. And here's what our portfolio looks like if they didn't engage with us very much other than just to take our money and build to their own vision. It pretty much looks like everybody else's portfolio. 1/3 die, 1/3 are sort of middling around, and 1/3 are making some progress. But here's what it looks like if you look at the ones that actually engage the process. It's crazy skewed. And those two big ones, by the way, the companies it's been about 2 years now, we've done 35 companies. They've raised about $65 million collectively. Investments from Google Ventures, Kleiner Perkins, Andreessen Horowitz, FF Ventures, Sigma Prime. So these are name brand venture capitalists who don't normally invest in Atlanta. That's part of the interesting thing about this. And so it's way skewed. I mean, if I were you and I was going to do a startup, I wouldn't want to be in the circle on the left. I'd want to be in the circle and the thing on the right. And if I were you and I was writing checks to startups, I wouldn't want to be writing checks to startups on the left. I would be wanting to write checks to startups on the right. That's the portfolio shape you want. That's the one you currently get. That's why I'm here, to share this with you. And let me stop there.
I want to start with some of the kind of questions that we've heard in the past and that I've wondered during this process. The first one is, this is so much theory. This is all theory. Can you give me some concrete examples?
By the way, this is not a question he agreed to ask me, someone.
Walk me through somebody who did something like this and what happened to them.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So I'm offering it to you in a way that's kind of fun. I hope more fun to listen to with the movie version and phrases like you cannot not. In the practice of it, it's very practical. In the practice of it, it's almost, it actually has an almost clinical feel to it, because what we've done is we have a framework that we've trained. We're in the process of training people, but mostly I've been operating under, where we work with an entrepreneur and their team, and we force them to put what they're saying into a form that we can then look at it that can help enable us to construct questions. The thing that's interesting about it is we force them to, in some ways, explicate what their current mindset is. That is, they think something is true about the world, and it almost always looks like, well, I think people want this, and I think they need this. And we find a way to show them how to put that into a form, which is in this kind of, which would be amenable to discovering this cannot not. And the form of that, which is hard to say, but I can tell it to you. I'm about to risk telling you something practical in a theoretical way. So, what you come up with are theories about people, about who they are and who they don't change being. And let me give you an example from the recent batch. I can try that. There was a team that came in, and it was. By the way, we've had a lot of serial entrepreneurs. One of the things that's interesting to me about this is quite a few of the entrepreneurs that have gone through our program aren't just like first-time entrepreneurs. One guy came through, he had sold his last company, used telematics, to Verizon for $617 million. So it's a little bit funny to have conversations with entrepreneurs that think that they know everything, just because they think they know everything. But eventually, every single person who's gone through this process turns around and they'll to a person tell you that they can't do the work differently. So this one example I'm thinking of is it's an email marketing company. The guy is a genius, and his partner was really talented at knowing how to figure things out about email addresses. They were going to sell that to large companies to make people who are email marketers be much better email marketers. He called them, he could make people be email marketing rock stars. And here's when he came into Flashpoint, here's what he was saying to us. He said, for example, I went to Coach, which is a retailer, and he went to Hilton, and he would get on the phone with someone who does email marketing, and he would describe what he does. And they would say, wow, that sounds great. You can like annotate my email list, and you can tell me whether I should mail things to them in the morning or the evening, or whether it's a man or a woman. And by the way, these people were buying it on the spot. So I think Coach had offered him like $10,000, like take my credit card now. It's like a monthly fee. And so this entrepreneur is telling me that it's, obviously they've got a really good business. And I'm thinking, well, it's in the wrong form. You can't possibly know you have a good business because first of all, it's a mud pie, which is hard to see. And second of all, you asked him what he wants, and he can't tell you because that's just sort of theoretically backwards. And by the way, you don't have a form, which is what could he not do? He could not be an email rock star. That'd be fine. He's been not an email rock star all this time. Now, when they did this work, eventually what happens is you get to a place where I'm going to tell you what happened, but it's so obvious you can't sort of believe how hard it was to get there. And the reason it's so obvious is because you end up with a name for something that you never had a name for, and then it becomes obvious. But you have to understand the world that he was in didn't have this word in it. So eventually he discovered that people who are emailers very often use email service providers, companies like MailChimp and Constant Contact, to send out big email lists for them. And it turns out that the email service providers have a problem, which is they can't be accused of spam, otherwise they get shut down. And so if an emailer shows up to an email service provider with a mailing list that's got 1 million names on it, and that mailing list has junk on it, the email service provider fires the emailer. And they're doing that all the time. They're firing about 10% of their customers every year. And so here was his idea. Here's what we ended up coming to. So what would happen if the email service provider, instead of firing the customer, simply sent them an email that said, we're about to fire you. If you'd like to have your email list cleaned up, go to this company. So with that simple idea, once you saw it for what it was, you say, look, an emailer is about to go from being an emailer to being a non-emailer. If you offered someone who was an emailer a way not to become a non-emailer, that should be unavoidable. That was the theory. Put up a website, had 2 pages, the ugliest thing you ever saw. He had a 58% conversion rate, and that company is running at well over $1 million a year run rate, and their servers are melting down because they have so much demand. By the way, he also went to the email service provider and said, listen, you're a customer hirer, right? You're not a customer firer. Why don't you send out this email instead of firing them? And they couldn't resist, and they just started sending out that email. So that's what it looks like in practice. And maybe that was a longer answer than you wanted, but you got me going.
Well, that example, like a lot of other examples that have come through Flashpoint, are software companies. So one question I have is this something that works in one segment or in one area and may not work in others, like drug discovery or something else?
Yeah,
like that?
It's a great question. We've thought about this question a lot. Everything that we know just is about human beings. So it's about human beings and business. And we've only seen it applied so far in companies that are information technology. That's just because that's who's walked through our door. And I can tell you what the work requires. The work requires that you have human beings that know their market and human beings that can have access to their market. So I suppose if you said, look, the problem is ultimately, can I find a small molecule drug that works for a particular target? That sounds a lot more, in many ways, like a technology problem. And I'm not sure this is about that. But if you can actually reach the market, that is, you can actually go do experiments on the human beings that are going to buy from you and the world around them, this should apply equally well to whatever kind of company you're going to make. In fact, one of the things that's interesting for us, and part of the reason that we're out talking about this is we've now found it applicable to large corporations, not just startups. So we have 3 corporations that are paying us to do work with them, and they sit among the startup teams. That allows us to do the work with the startup teams. So that's an interesting part of a business model. But we're now thinking that maybe we have this process understood well enough that what would it look like if it wasn't a startup that did it? What would it look like if you had a lot of money to spend and you actually needed to get a reliable innovation? We actually see our way now clear to see how would you spend that money efficiently, as opposed to just betting on a team too much money to see if they get anywhere. It's part of what we're trying to figure out.
Mm-hmm. Just to push on your evidence a little bit, and it's very impressive, the two ovals with the teams. But the oldest of those have only gone through this process 18 months ago, right?
Right.
So what makes you think this creates sustainable companies, that's something for the long term?
Yeah, this is a great question. I don't know the answer. I mean, it could easily be the case. I mean, you could invite me back in 5 years, and maybe I'll have a better answer. One of the puzzles with all of this is we can now see clearly what people weren't attending to. So it's, for me, it's a little bit like the difference between alchemy and chemistry. So what people were not attending to were errors they were definitely making. Now, whether if you attend to those errors, so you could choose not to attend to the errors. That's what people have been doing. If you choose not to attend to them, we know what the outcome looks like. It looks like 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. If you do choose to attend to them, then even in this short period of time, you start to get that kind of a skewed distribution. It certainly could be the case that the things that kill startups or kill any kind of innovation show up again shortly, and that this didn't really help. I suppose that's possible. I doubt it. I mean, it seems in the practice of it, it just seems so much more accurate that I can really recommend it. But there's no way to, kind of like there's no way to prove that science works. It just, here's the difference. If you don't do it, it doesn't work, and if you do it, it works. This has the same sort of feel to it at this stage.
Can you talk, there's a lot of buzz and activity around what's called lean startup. And you talked a little bit about minimum viable product, but they're pivoting, iteration, continuous launch, all these kinds of buzzwords that are going on that. Can you position it a little bit? I mean, are you taking stuff from that? Are you in opposition to it?
Is that a common topic here, lean startup, and people paying attention to that stuff? Steve Blank wrote a book called The 4 Steps to the Epiphany, in which he suggests the following thing. He said it actually started somewhat the way my talk started today, that companies that really work, they don't work on the idea you invested in, they work on the third idea. That's what evidence shows. And so he has this great idea. He says, well, why not just do the third idea first? So, or another way of saying it is like, why don't you just build things that people want to buy? Which sounds on the face of it very like a really good idea. And I like the idea that you should spend some time at the beginning before you build something to figure out what people are going to want to buy, if you could make sense of that. But then the question is, how do you actually do it? And what we found is just building product and iterating against product, it doesn't give you the information you want, and we try to figure out why that was. So I like very much this idea that you should make it lean and you should make it minimal. I just don't know how to make it work out of a product. And the reason is, I think philosophically, you can't get the information you need from a product because they're all mud pies. And so you have to do something else. Maybe it's the case that once you've actually found the situation in which people are buying something and you've sort of figured out like why they're buying and what to do, maybe you can iterate on like, well, should it be brown or should it be red or should it be a big button or a little button? Maybe there, but what we're talking about is maybe before that happens. That's a place where there's just a lot of error that we seem to be able to do better now.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Sort of in the same vein, there's been a lot of movement around creating accelerators and incubators. It seems like every town, lots of big companies now have these things. Flashpoint, in a lot of ways, looks like one of those places.
Yeah, it's very exciting, by the way. You come, the teams are intense, and investors show up, and there's a lot of that kind of serendipity going on. It's really fun.
Yeah, but fun is great, but how is it different? And what is it that's Flashpoint is, how do you position yourself with respect to incubators or
accelerators? Yeah, so, I mean, if those things worked, we would be doing them. The place I was going to fail is I agreed on behalf of the university to run something which would actually cause some difference in wealth creation. So we went and studied like crazy what was going on with these accelerators. As far as we can tell, what happens is activity but no economic change. That's what it looks like. So you get a lot of mentors to show up. People will write checks to small teams. A lot of T-shirts get made. But it doesn't seem to change the distribution of output. And so we had to ask ourselves what to do about that. You know, I don't know. So there's a part of me that thinks if you just want more innovation, then you could just make incubators. And you'll still get the same distribution. You just have more people playing the game. So if you're only going to have 1 in 100 successes, and you're okay with 1 in 100, and you just need more people to have success, then you just create more incubators and more accelerators. What was interesting to us was, could we affect the portfolio? So could we make it so that many more investments turned out to be much more successful? And could we make the investments that happen be less likely to fail? And that's the tack we've taken. So our own feeling right now, we have a lot of inbound interest from other accelerators. So it's literally, I think there's not a town or surrounding Atlanta that has any kind of sizable population that hasn't called us and said, we have a building, we have a little bit of money we want to invest, we want to make an accelerator. And our usual response is, well, if you're just looking for activity, then you don't need this. But if you're actually looking, let's say, if it actually matters to you what the outcomes are, like it's your money or somebody else's, you care about money, or you actually care about whether the entrepreneurs are successful, then I think that's where we have something that's more interesting to offer right now.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Hi. You mentioned that people are immune to change. Like you went over 3 things, and then you mentioned people are, innovators are people, and then as well, and people are immune to change. And one solution you proposed is developing development cultures, embedding development cultures in companies for innovation. So what's your experience in embedding these cultures? Just in parentheses, I'm just asking this question because I've been working in Six Sigma process improvement. I had my own consulting firm in Canada, which I had to close down because I'm non-resident now. And also I went through the methodologies of cognitive behavior and personal basis, and then NLP, neuro-linguistic language, and Tony Robbins, all motivational speakers. So I don't know what incentivize, just to embed that development culture, because it's very hard to have sustainable change in companies.
Yeah. So a couple things. Everything except for the last 2 things, NLP and Tony Robbins, they all might have some sort of scientific basis. So NLP is discredited pseudoscience, and Tony Robbins is tall and charismatic. The person who did Tony Robbins' business with him is a woman named Beth Polish, who's been working with us a little bit on this, so I have a little bit of insight into what's going on there. This notion of sustainable change, here's what Keegan and Leahy figured out, and they wrote a great book called Immunity to Change. I just really recommend it to you. What they laid out is, you have to first start with what's called an improvement goal. An improvement goal is something that people can actually identify, where they can identify with. That's a place that they're trying to move towards. So for example, I'd like to lose weight. I would, actually, and sometimes that's an improvement goal for me. And how do you know? How do you see it? Well, one thing is, or maybe I'll give you another one that's maybe more topical. I interrupt people. How do I know? Because my wife points it out to me, and I've tried to stop interrupting people, and I know I'd be better off if I didn't interrupt people. So the characteristic of an improvement goal is you sort of know you have it, you sort of recognize it, people tell you about it, especially your family and other people around you. Now, there are things that one could do to lose weight, like I could go to the gym more often, or I could not eat that extra piece of cake. And you'd think I'm a relatively smart guy. If I really wanted to lose weight, then if that made any sense, then I would stop eating the cake. So here's what Keegan and Leahy figured out is you can identify the behaviors that impinge. So for example, if eating an extra piece, for me, I'll tell you what it really is. What it really is I have cereal at night when I'm anxious about giving talks the next day. Okay, so there it is. And so you'd think, well, if I could, why not, maybe there are a couple of things I could change. I could not give talks. I could not have the cereal. I mean, it's just obvious what I could change, but I still don't change it. And here's what they've observed, in which they show you actually ways to work it out, is it's almost always the case the behavior is in service of something else. That is, you could ask someone, for example, well, suppose you just stopped doing that behavior. What are you worried about? And you can often move that to a place where you discover the worry is actually in service of a commitment that's never going to change, but there's some big assumption that they have that ties the behavior and the worry and the commitment together. And once you see that for what it is, your product can simply take the big assumption off the table. And a typical example would be, someone eats a piece of cake and they can't stop themselves from eating a piece of cake at dinner, and they remember that their father said, I don't want you to ever grow up feeling like you're deprived. And every time the person thinks about not having the piece of cake, he says, well, I don't want to lead a deprived life. So eating the cake is in service of the commitment to not be deprived. And you're never going to get the person to stop eating cake if they're committed to not being deprived, even if they want to lose weight. And so you have to create some other opportunity for them to find that not eating cake doesn't make them not deprived. at which point they can actually change the behavior. So anyway, that's the sort of mapping, and I highly recommend it. It seems very effective. Now, as far as actually building it into culture, Bob Keegan and Lisa Leahy have a new thing called deliberately developmental organizations. We're trying to put that into our cultures. We're definitely seeing that some of the startups from the most recent batch, where we've paid a lot more attention to this, are actively doing things to try to keep that culture in their company. For example, they're figuring out new hiring methods. They're finding ways to work with the employees that they're hiring to be able to inculcate them into this new process, this new type of method. So I think the days are early. I'm convinced that it has to happen, that it makes a difference. So that's the answer.
You mentioned that for most people, the value of not losing something is larger than gaining the same thing. Does any profile buck the trend? For instance, does entrepreneurs, because we know gamblers might have a different profile.
So there's been a lot of study about this, and I'm not a world's expert on it, but I've become somewhat expert as a consumer of it. So if you plot on the x-axis any physical object that people experience and a 0 point where people currently are, as long as they can tell you that they feel gain in this direction and loss in this direction, so it could be like your salary. It's called prospect theory if you want to look it up. If you can map a physical variable like your salary or your current net worth or how many fingers you have, I don't know. So anything that's measurable versus your sense of, well, if I had more of that, it's gain, and if I had less of it, it would be loss. So more salary is gain, less of it's loss. And by the way, there's always a psychological 0 set point, so it's your current salary. So 5 years from now, that set point moves, and that's your current set point. Here's what they found. That gain curve and that loss curve are asymmetric. The loss curve is on a typical person, a slope of 2.25 times steeper than the gain curve. That's just the way it is. So the amount of loss you experience on any psychological scale. Now maybe for some people it's a little bit different, or maybe what you perceive as loss is different from what someone else has perceived as loss, but you're always going to have the asymmetry. That's just the way it is. I mean, it's useful, for example, for startups. Here's like a useful application. If you have to lay off people, let's say you have to lay off 20 people, are you better off laying them all off at once, or you're better off laying them off one at a time? You can actually figure it out from the graph. The answer is, if you lay them off one at a time, then you're constantly repeating the steep part of the graph. It's the negative part. So you're simply better off taking the loss all at once from a psychological point of view.
I want to get more questions, and I'll let you in a minute, but there's one kind of question I wanted to put out to the audience, because I'm interested in your comments and thoughts on it, and also to Merrick, which is, what we're doing is working with startups at an early stage over a short period of time that are doing things very efficiently, we hope, and we're helping them with that. But we're sitting here in Abu Dhabi, where there's an appetite for big, complex projects, where there's a lot of resources, a lot of capital. So a question that I've had in my mind since we got here is, how is this, what we're doing, applicable to this situation here? And I'd love your thoughts on that, and I'd love the thoughts of anybody else as well.
I mean, my immediate thought is that it looks like there are 2 stages of doing a startup. So one stage is, if you can figure out what it is you have to do, and you know that you're not going to be constrained by capital once you figure it out, then that may be a better thing. So, because even our startups have to go raise capital, and they're still limited by the amount of capital they can raise. But the other piece of it is, if you want to do something really big, you could also get it wrong by trying to follow your vision to what to make. So you kind of sort of have to use stuff. I mean, this ought to be applicable in any project where you haven't already decided that you know for sure what it is you're going to make. And so scale shouldn't matter. My own feeling, I think I mentioned it during the talk, my own thought right now, and the kind of thing we're moving towards Flashpoint, is we're bringing in companies to work with that have more resources to spend. Because startups end up not doing as much of this work as they would do, as they were drawn to do, given the limited capital they have. So there are a lot of things you could do which are experiments in the world that are really worthwhile doing. It's just that if you don't have the capital, you don't do it. And I think if you do have the capital and you did it, it might be very interesting to see what happened then.
You've talked about startups where they're literally starting there. What about startups that are midstream and are having that realization of, oh my gosh, this is going to fail. Is there a way to turn the ship applying startup engineering?
Yes, the answer is for sure yes. Almost always what we've seen happen is it ends up being quite different than where you started, although it tends to stay in the same market. In fact, one of the things that we find, which is kind of, it's good to know it now because we've seen it enough times, is that about 3 or 4 weeks into the process, everybody is like so depressed they want to just cry and not come into the work. Because they find, what we sort of force them to find is this, this quieting process. I didn't say enough about that, but the process isn't to go look for something that will work. The process is, let's put into the world a test to see whether they can really avoid it. And then when you do that, it gets quieter. The world gets quieter. And you keep quieting it and quieting it and quieting it until all that's left is something that you cannot quiet. No matter how hard you try, they're going to buy. You try to stop them from buying, they won't stop. That's what it feels like. Now, what that means for most people is pretty soon they discover the thing they thought was going to work. They find lots of evidence that people could just ignore it and it's not reliable. And they get very depressed. But if we can keep them going, then a significant fraction of them seem to find something which becomes undeniable. So I think that's the answer. Now, in practice, what happens is people raise too much money. And then you've got a board and you've got investors and everybody's sort of bought into the fantasy. And then you say to them, well, look, I think what we were doing was not right. We'd like to sort of shift now, please. And they say, well, but wait, how do you know when the right time is? And a lot of times you've given up so much equity that it's kind of hard to make that kind of a change. So in every case it's individual, but we've seen it.